There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering, indeed, in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning. But since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early, the cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so somber and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question.
Jonathan Harker's journal, kept in shorthand. 3 May, Bistritz. Left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on 1st May, arriving at Vienna early the next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46. The train was an hour late. Budapest seems a wonderful place, from the glimpse which I got of it from the train, and the little I could walk through the streets. Having some time at my disposal when in London, I had visited the British Museum and made my search among the books and maps in the library regarding Transylvania.
It's you. Hi, welcome to Each Retelling, the podcast where we explore all the ways old tales are made new. I'm your host, Jasmine Garcia, and... Okay, listen. Sam and River are joining us for another book club type episode, and I didn't mind them tearing apart. If I'm being honest, it kind of deserved it. But I'm actually a little concerned about this one, because I really liked Reluctant Immortals, and sure, I know it's Monster Month. But I didn't think that meant I would have to possibly face more Shakespearean threats. Oh, fuck, I forgot they live in the walls. Hi, guys!
Hello, Jasmine.
Fuck.
I hope you're ready for what I have in store for you.
Oh, goddammit.
Reader, I'm Sam Marchioni, and I have feelings.
It's River, and your secret is safe with my indifference?
Okay, so I'm not being threatened in Shakespearean again. That's good.
Oh no, that's for another day. That's for another day.
Anyway, like I mentioned before, today we're going to be covering something a little unusual. This is the book Reluctant Immortals by Gwendolyn Kiste, and this is kind of a sequel / crossover of Dracula and Jane Eyre, starring Lucy Westenra. And Sam, I know this is going to bother you. I know you prefer calling her Antoinetta. I understand, but we're going off of how the book refers to her. Well, she goes by B. Mason, but listeners might know her better as Bertha Mason Rochester.
I'm just gonna ahead of the game. Now, please read Wide Sargasso Sea if you never have. I once on Twitter made a joke about reading Wide Sargasso Sea, and people got so mad at me because I dunked on Edward Rochester and Jane Eyre. I'm not saying don't read Jane Eyre, I'm saying read Jane Eyre with the added context of Wide Sargasso Sea, because Jane Eyre is complicated, and we'll get into it as we go through my history with these things.
Absolutely, yes. But you might be wondering, listeners, what the hell do Dracula and Jane Eyre really have to do with each other other than being part of the Western canon? Not very much, that is true, although one could definitely argue there are many Gothic elements to the original Jane Eyre novel, and this book kind of just yes-anded it. And how?
So, here's the thing. I preface all of this with cultural osmosis is a hell of a drug.
Of course.
Which means while I have never read the original Dracula nor Dracula Daily, I keep meaning to sign up for it, and I miss it every time.
They've got a book now. I've got it right here.
I'm well aware, but I keep missing it. But between Dracula and Jane Eyre, I have never read either source material. What I have gleaned from the pop culture at large makes this an interesting read, I guess, but also one that gets really, really complicated in the nitty-gritty details, which I'm sure we're going to get into.
Yeah, let's make it official. So what is everyone's experience with both Dracula and Jane Eyre? Again, we are still trying to avoid work because while SAG-AFTRA, as of this recording, is in discussions, nothing is finalized yet. Cross fingers, folks.
Okay, so for me, Dracula, I think I read like a kiddified version of the books. I don't know, do we count Banicula as a Dracula adaptation?
I mean, one could definitely argue it wouldn't exist without Dracula, but I'm not sure how much it took from the original story.
But anyway, most of my exposure to Dracula has been through struck work that we can't really talk about. But even then, I have read with the book and engaged with the book enough that I understand the book just as a book. Shout out to both Dom Noble of Lost in Adaptation and Red of Overly Sarcastic Productions. I actually was rewatching Red's sarcastic summary of Dracula recently.
Yeah! I did that yesterday. We love my internet boss.
You do good work, Red. I really
Shout
like
out-
your stuff.
Shout out to Red and Blue and the rest of the color-coded OSP team.
But Jane Eyre, I have a much deeper connection to. I remember this vividly in high school. I was in the graphic novel section of our library, and there was a graphic novel version of Jane Eyre that preserved Bronte's original writing. It didn't dumb it down.
I love those.
And there were gorgeous illustrations, so that was my first exposure to Jane Eyre.
That's a very good first exposure. That makes it
Yeah,
really accessible.
some
but
visually
still-
striking image that unfortunately did lean heavily into the visual horror of the madwoman in the attic for my poor sweet Antoinetta. And then I discovered a modernized adaptation, literary adaptation, simply titled Jane by April Lindner, who also did a Wuthering Heights adaptation. I forget if it's called Kathy or something else. I can't stand Wuthering Heights, so that book did not stay with me, but the Jane book stayed with me because it was a modern AU that skipped over most of Jane's traumatic early life and just went straight to the Rochester thing. And in this version, Rochester is a reclusive ex-music star called Nico Rathburn. And now I actually have to go back and read it again because I want to see if I can remember all the details of that and how that book handles the Antoinetta of it all. But
Listen, I'll be glad to do an episode on that someday. That sounds interesting.
But I'm not done yet because now we have to go into my grad school time at University of Houston, where while I was getting my interdisciplinary certificate in women and gender studies, I took a class called feminist criticism. That's where I not only revisited Jane Eyre, but I read Wide Sargasso Sea and fell in love with Wide Sargasso Sea and that version of Antoinetta. But I was also, at the same time, part of my master's in theater meant being the dramaturg on productions at University of Houston School of Theater and Dance. And we did a play called Dear Charlotte by Joy Gregory, which is basically a bioplay about Charlotte Bronte. So I did extensive amounts of research into that. I made like a Bronte family tree. I translated some French. I read the Bronte Juvenalia, which is really weird to read now. The Juvenalia is stuff that the Bronte sisters and their brother Branwell created when they were younger.
Oh, that
like,
is-
it's more heavily speculative fiction. It's more like fantasy stuff. And so the thing about reading Jane Eyre in a feminist criticism class is that you talk a lot about Jane Eyre as a feminist novel in terms of one of my least favorite phrases in the English vernacular, groundbreaking for its time. Because being the autistic pedant that I am, I'm like, something can only be groundbreaking in its time. The ground has been broken. You cannot re-break the ground. But Jane Eyre was a milestone in terms of being a book that was not about a super gorgeous heroine, a book where marriage was, like Pride and Prejudice, a book where marriage transfers from being an economic proposition to a romantic partnership. And at one point we also went into like tangents about whether or not St. John is totally gay, which my professor advocated he was. That's how his name is pronounced, by the way. It's written down as St. John. It's pronounced St. John, but
Sure,
yeah.
proceed.
Anyway, complicated feelings about the original Jane Eyre at this point, because you can say it's a groundbreaking feminist novel, but it's really a white feminist groundbreaking novel, because boy, the colonialism. Like, people tried to tell me that Jane Eyre was not a colonialist. I'm like, how does she get her inheritance from that uncle again? Where did Rochester get his first wife? What's St. John planning on doing? These are British people. Colonialism is gonna be involved.
Yeah. And like I said in a very recent episode, the Western canon is a fucking minefield for the progressively minded. And it sucks that stories with these elements put in without any critical eye are such a foundation of how we're taught literature.
I cringe every time a revival of Oliver happens because the revivals of Oliver don't really tend to change much around Fagin. I'm like, even Dickens was sorry for what he did with Fagin.
It was. And good for him there.
I don't think Charlotte Bronte ever apologized for how she depicted the people of the Caribbean.
Doubtful. And my ancestors deserve better. But yeah, as for me, I definitely got into Jane Eyre before because here's a nice little plot twist for you listeners. I was not originally much of a horror fan. I was such a fraidy cat growing up, actually.
That absolutely tracks.
Yeah, I guess that's not too surprising to people who actually know me, but
Yeah,
But,
I can see it.
Yeah, no, I was very much the fraidy cat to horror-loving adult pipeline. And what basically created that in between is recognizing that while, yes, I have anxiety, horror stories are way less scary than real life. So yeah, the reason I actually read Jane Eyre was because a friend of the show, Beth Early, my best friend from high school, they actually recommended an entirely different series, the Thursday Next series. Either of you familiar with that?
No.
I don't think so.
It is alternate universe kind of thing, but more importantly, you could travel through books pretty much. And in this universe, Sam, you're going to be very angry at this part, because in this universe, Jane Eyre originally ends with Jane never going back to Rochester. And the quote-unquote happy ending of the story fixes that. That's what ends up happening at the end. That is the happy ending. Jane and Rochester being kind of urged back together by the machinations. Oh, honey, are you okay?
I did not think that through.
No, you didn't. Oh my god, are you okay?
Listeners, I just took one of my notebooks to do a face palm thing and it hurt. But not as much as hearing that resolution.
Yeah.
Incredible.
So I was really intrigued by it because what I liked was that she was willing to stand up for herself, but she wasn't loud about it. And I think it did kind of rewire some of my views on how a female character should be, for better or worse. And, there were definitely some moments where it almost looked like it was gearing towards spooky, but since that wasn't something I was really looking for in my fiction, it didn't bother me that it didn't end up being as spooky as it could have been. Eventually, I did get more into vampire media, and unfortunately, we do need to address that it's mostly because of the Twilight series, and I profusely apologize. Did eventually get into the various Draculas. I am not going to mention the main two. I am gonna, however, mention this in the Carmilla episode as well, that there is a really good podcast called Fictional, where their whole thing is retelling a bunch of classic stories that may be a little inaccessible to a modern audience, and the Dracula episodes there are really fun and pretty comprehensive as far as I can tell. I actually have not read Dracula in full, even though I own Dracula Daily as well as an illustrated copy, because I'm that kind of book nerd. From what I know of it, I am basically of the opinion that the romanticization of Dracula in media is a problem. I understand that it is way too fucking late to stop that, so fuck it, let people have fun with it. But with that said, this is not a romantic story. It is horrifying. They are watching people die all around them, especially with what happened to poor Lucy. Justice for fucking Lucy, and that is part of what intrigued me about the subject of this episode.
So, reluctant immortals.
Yes, and now for why I was terrified to let these two in, listeners. I adored this. I fucking loved this. This is my jam. I know for a fact I am, once again, the only one, but maybe it's not as terrifying if I'm being honest, even though I loved this book far, far more. I did not love, if I'm being honest. You know I didn't, listeners, if you listened to that episode. But
my overwhelming thoughts can be boiled down to two things, and I will probably be able to elaborate more on them as we talk, but my two big things are, number one, on the one hand, I did plow through this in 3 hours, managed to read it, so something must have kept me going. Okay, I lied, there's three things. I understand that a lot of this story can be boiled down to metaphor for abuse survivor, and how to and not to cope with the various scars that emotional and physical abuse leave you with, and how those things tend to bounce off of each other like pinballs. And I think it would have better served the story better if this had been a split POV between B and Lucy rather than strictly Lucy.
That I will actually agree with you. One criticism I do have is that we really did not get enough of B.
Because
it's a
straight
very
up
short book. We were bitching about how fucking long, if I'm being honest, was.
This needed another 10 chapters, but also I don't think the plot was strong enough to carry another 10 chapters.
Yeah.
Unless you had done the split POV thing, and when B just fucking disappears in the middle of the second act.
Don't know that it's as much a plot book as it is a feelings book.
Yes, it's very much
And that's
a feelings
something that I think works in its favor. But so I was actually, yesterday I was in an airport for 6 hours, and so I told people they could ask me anything. Diva of Musical Hell asked me what I'm currently reading, and I answered. Diva had never heard of Reluctant Immortals, but said it sounded interesting. And the reply I sent was that, yeah, my inner pedant, my inner dramaturg, and my inner feminist are fighting about it, but it is certainly a fascinating book, and I'm all about transformative works like this. So let me elaborate a little bit. My inner pedant is upset because of how the revisions to Lucy's story were made. Specifically, I'm talking about how Arthur, Quincy, and Jack are framed. Because I actually think that is one of the most interesting and progressive elements of Stoker's novel. Would I prefer it if they had all revealed themselves to be polyamorous and, asked Lucy to be part of a polycule? Yes, of course, but this is Victorian London, and that's not gonna fucking happen. But to me, it was incredibly interesting and mature that these three guys are like, okay, we're best friends, we're all in love with this same girl, so rather than have a macho pissing contest over it, let's all just present ourselves to her, say, I love you, I want to marry you, and leave it up to her, and no matter what she decides, we're cool with it. And I liked how in the original book, Lucy was cool with it. She famously was like, why can't a girl marry as many men as she wants to, or at least as many that want her? So that was really interesting to me, and yes, it's part of the whole Victorian repression of it all, and the tragedy of it all, but I don't fully appreciate the choice in this to turn Holmwood, Seward, and Morris into stereotypical macho controlling men who are all trying to possess Lucy, and Lucy looks back at them with this, oh, they didn't see the real me, they just had this idolized version of me on the pedestal.
Yeah, I'm always nervous with quote-unquote feminist retellings of stories.
Yeah.
Simply because there is a tendency to, do that to the source material where you're like, it's not, do not get me started on feminist Greek myth retellings, or I will start chewing drywall, but...
Mythology retellings are harder to pin down because there's so much that we don't know, as opposed to a concretely written down source like this one. So
yeah,
that's my beef with Lucy, but I do enjoy the idea of this thing where Lucy does not die, but keeps coming back from a limbo section, a purgatory room,
a purgatorial waiting room.
And
I did kind of love those scenes.
She and Dracula, that feels like a really good abuse metaphor that's really interesting to play out in my mind, especially with the added plot element of Dracula in the urns. God, I loved that. And I loved the whole thing of Mina in the waiting room every time Lucy gets back there. Do I wish it had been kind of a little more queer?
Yes!
Kinda.
Listen, I swear to God, 40 or 50% of the way through this book, I'm like, where's the fucking reveal that Lucy is just in love with B? Where is that reveal? That's the reason she's so bitchy at Jane, is partially because of all of the bullshit she has learned through B about what happened with Jane and Rochester and what have you. But also the inherent eroticism of the only female friend you've ever had. Or the only other female friend you've ever had.
Pals.
Just gals being pals. And they were roommates!
Yeah, I agree with you, the tropes were there, but I'm actually kind of relieved they didn't go that route.
I'm more relieved that they didn't set up Lucy with Michael. Holy shit, was I nervous about that?
They kind of did, but
no, but in the
Michael...
end, he goes off with Daisy.
Yes, and that was the right decision.
Oh my god, I didn't even remember, because the book just ends so abruptly. Also, was anybody else spending the entire book thinking, oh fuck, Daisy isn't Daisy Buchanan, is she?
No, I was, oh god, where do we fucking start with this book?
The dramaturg thing was mostly regards to all the work I did on Dear Charlotte and all the time I spent with the works of the Brontes. So here's the thing. Rochester being an abuser and a predator, I'm fine with that. Because you have to remember, Jane Eyre is 19.
Yeah.
In the original book, she's 19 and he's 40, and that's creepy. I'm sorry, that's creepy. Especially especially because she's also his employee.
I gotta ask, what do you say to the people who try to say that that was just normal at the time?
Just because it was normal doesn't mean it was right.
Fuck yeah.
But I guess I was frustrated, and I think this could have been solved with some of your suggestions, River, for a split POV. Like, I wish we had more explanation for how Rochester's immortality monster thingy worked.
Like, my assumptions were, at first, before it was revealed that it was Rochester's problem, I was like, did he co-opt some voodoo shit that he learned? Voodoo shit in, like, Hollywood air quotes, because I'm not disrespecting the actual religious practices, but, like, the Hollywood explanation of how voodoo works.
Thank God they didn't.
But then
First
they give
met
the explanation that, like, it's always been at Thornfield or something.
Yeah, the explanation is that it's basically a familial curse. It's a manifestation of the Rochesters, like, as a familial line, their greed because they're landlords. It's like their greed and their need to repossess everything, and it just sort of created this unruly, unholy monster that lived in the
I feel like
attic.
I'd need to dig back into English folklore and see where the root for that comes, because that's the other part of the inner dramaturg that was screaming. I'm like, I need to know the rules so I know whether or not to be mad. I'm a sucker for world building, so I kind of wish that we'd gotten a little more of that in this book.
To me, the conceit that it isn't quite one singular ghost of a singular dead person. It's more just a manifestation of the absolute horrendous shit that the Rochester family has done. That is not uncommon in ghost stories. Just the manifestation of all the awful things that have happened on this land. It's not uncommon in Gothic literature from what little I've gleaned of it, especially from the likes of Monster She Wrote. That is a very good book if you want to learn more about this era of fiction. So that didn't bother me too much. And the fact that Rochester decided to take what should have been a sign that maybe he should change his ways and used it to kind of give himself more power is very in line with the good Gothic villain.
You want to talk rules? I have a thought about rules. So first of all, I fucking love the sunlight decision.
Yes.
I am obsessed with the sunlight decision. For those who have not read this book acknowledges that Death by Sunlight is a later vampiric edition, but sunlight has been retroactively so ingrained into the canon that every other vampire medium has to either explain why it isn't the case or leaned into it and said, yes, it is a problem. So what this book decides to do is, because it is using Dracula as its bare bones and acknowledges that, like, the sunlight is a later edition, instead of burning up, what it essentially forces Lucy to do is to have a PTSD-induced panic attack or a PTSD-induced flashback. It's described in such a way that it is basically crippling, but it won't kill her.
Yeah, because in fairness, in the novel, it is implied that yes, it does weaken him somewhat if he's in the
Like,
sun.
he can't use his powers
Yeah,
during
so
that point.
So it makes perfect sense.
Which is kind of dumb when you consider that he can also only transform his bodies at, like, noon,
Dusk.
midnight, and...
Noon, dusk, and dawn, I think is what
like,
it is.
Well, yeah, so, like, why the hell is noon even in the equation if he can't...
I don't know, man.
Bram?
Listen, we're not gonna hold a dead writer accountable for things he wrote. I do also like the addition that Dracula smells like roses, because leaving a wild rose stalk on his coffin was supposed to prevent him from not rising from his coffin, which, hey, modern horror writers, get on that shit.
That is an awesome imagery right there. There is
Yeah.
so much that I feel like they could absolutely take from the classics more often.
Yeah, so that, like, that edition and the silver, which is sort of one of those things that gets squidgy depending on who you're talking to, mostly because, you know, silver historically has just been one of those sterile metals, and it accounts for, like, what Red OSP addresses in their Dracula summary is the drift from vampire as unholy being to just straight creature of the night, which is why my final thing about the rules, and then I will go into my thoughts about Dracula in this book, because I have thoughts about him. Added power of things decaying around because you are associated with death. That's a neat detail.
I
don't
love
know
that
if
so
that has
much. Ouch.
I don't know if it has precedent anywhere else, but that's a neat detail.
I don't
I mean,
think
they
so.
also kind of made it sound like every time he dies, he comes back, like, a little stronger or something. Or, like, his powers have grown and evolved, because Lucy's powers grow and evolve throughout the story.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that makes sense, because if he's died so many times, the rot and decay would just cling to him more.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of the idea that it's like this aura of you are very clearly something that is not supposed to be here anymore. And for some reason, the natural order has not taken you. Basically, the mushrooms keep trying to come for your dinner. keep trying to come for dinner, and you won't let them? Criminal. But I have more experience with talking about Dracula than I do about talking about Rochester.
Mhm.
Rochester, fine and dandy. If you're gonna tell me you're writing a gothic horror novel and you're gonna go the abuse survivor metaphor route, I know I say this very flippantly, I think it's a good framing device as any. I don't personally really sort of go with it, but then again, I account that as someone who has never been through emotional abuse. I've had a relatively normal life, and so it's part of the social blind spot I never want to gain, I think is the best way I can frame that.
That's
So I'm
valid as
gonna
hell.
talk about Dracula, who is a more tangible threat, all things considered. Rochester is a skeeving English bastard, but he's killable. You could put a bullet through his head and it would be fine. Dracula, on the other hand, is a literal monster, TMCR, no doubts about it. He is not the first, but he is sort of the, I don't want to say platonic ideal, but he has sort of become the Western platonic ideal of what a vampire is. Nary a hunchback or clawed finger in sight. All these vampires nowadays, all they know how to be is be bisexual, handsome, and lie. And so cultural osmosis is a hell of a drug, because they've I'm not going to say defanged, because I'm not that much of a pun artist, but they've declawed Dracula to so much. Like, he's a dad in a kid's movie. He's a weird thing that pops up. Motherfucker, in the Moon Knight comic run right at the moment, he currently lives in Chernobyl. Like, he's just a thing that exists.
And even though it's not technically canon, one of his greatest memes is the Moon Knight, where's my goddamn money?
Yeah,
big
like,
nerd.
It's not real, and I hate that it's not real.
We all
Listen,
do. We all do.
If you hate the fact that it's not real, I recommend reading Jed McKay's current run, where vampires are an MLM scheme.
That actually makes way too much
That
sense.
tracks.
It's incredible. Please read Jed McKay's current Moon Knight run. Point is that Dracula, I'm like, I can't take you seriously.
You're off in a romantic interest.
You're so often a romantic interest that I can't. I know, like this, I know we're going the whole, it's always the charming ones that get you.
Yeah.
But I'm too much of a monster fucker for that to work. And I think that means that, like, on a deep level, like, the you are not immune to propaganda thing, like, you are not immune to Dracula's seductions. But it does take me out of the book.
You know, I definitely get that. I think maybe because Sam and I are more familiar with, like, the original stories, I wonder if maybe that's why it's worked a little better.
Also, the funniest line in this book continues to be when Rochester wants to try and kill Lucy about something stupid, and Dracula basically tells him, lay a finger on her and I'll kill you. And Rochester's like, you wanted to kill her too! And he's like, yes, but that's me. You don't touch her. How romantic. The two of them fighting over who gets to murder me.
Yes.
That's the funniest line in this entire goddamn book by a country mile. Which is another thing that I'm kind of, again, I feel like it's another one of those, like, I can't tell if I'm too much of a monster fucker or too much of a, I don't have abuse as part of my cultural lexicon. I feel like this book should have been at least a smidge more funny. I feel like motherfuckers, you are immortal, and you have had to cope with immortality for at least 2 decades.
7 decades.
7 decades, yeah. Like, there is a sense that I'm like, I am fairly certain that this is my, like, I am well aware that abuse does not make you good, and abuse does not make anything make sense, and, like, these are all rational reactions for these characters in this circumstance to be having. But man, do I kind of just want to send everyone to therapy.
I mean, yes, obviously, that would solve most things. I will say I do have an argument for funniest line. Does it grant 3 wishes? No, it'll take away your wishes, your hopes and dreams too. Bummer, she says. I'm sorry, that kind of slaps.
That's a good one, but I stand by the how touching they're arguing about who gets to murder me.
Oh, and she passes me the joint like a consolation prize.
So I didn't have a funniest line, but that does actually lead into another thing that I felt was a bit of an issue with this book. The characters that were based on Bronte and Stoker's original works, they felt the most fleshed out, and unfortunately the characters that Kista was creating for herself, they feel painted in very broad strokes and very unsympathetic strokes. Like, I can't even remember all the names of, like, Rochester's 3 creepy little Stepford wives.
Bellwood, Vervain, and Rowan. And the only reason I remember them is because A, I read it 2 days ago, and B, they're all flowers, and C, I think they're supposed to lean more heavily on Dracula's 3 brides.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I get that, but
Absolutely.
the way that they act, it's all so culty that my first thought is
Yeah,
Stepford
exactly.
wives.
I feel like them acting culty and not having much of a personality is kind of the point. It's that these men have taken who they are from them.
Yeah, I get that, but it's also a matter of perspective, because the way Lucy looks at them, I feel like there's still an amount of disdain and not indifference, but
She looks down on them, and
she
I do
looks
agree
down
with you.
on them in a way that I don't really appreciate, because it's that mentality of, well, I got over traumatic thing that happened to me, so why can't you be strong? It's stuff like that.
I don't think you're supposed to like that she does that, though. And, like, part of her arc is definitely realizing, no, I have to try to help. You do see this a lot, unfortunately. There are victims who manage to get out who do look down on those who don't, because when you don't deal with it, and as River said, yes, most of these problems could have been solved if everyone had gone to therapy, but of course that can't happen because otherwise there won't be a book. And also historically, that just wouldn't have worked. They'd just be in an asylum. Yeah, I do believe that was fully intentional and supposed to be part of how she goes from focusing all of her emotional energy on B and occasionally Mina when she's on the other side, to recognizing, no, we're all getting fucked over here. We need to help these girls. She does do that eventually.
I mean, if that's the case, I don't think Michael should have been in the picture at all.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
Or Daisy, honestly. Like, it felt
Daisy?
like Michael and Daisy just kind of clouded it, because Michael and Daisy, she did have more personal connections to them, and so they kind of pulled focus from the nameless victims. And
well, I kind of saw it as a progression.
My thing with Michael is the quintessential vampire classic of put the obvious feeding device on a hook on the string and try and see how long you can go without taking a bite out of it. That's the other thing. This book suffers a lot from transititis, and I understand some of it because it's a lot of living in these characters' heads and getting from A to B, and living in their heads is a good way to do transitions. Like, and I also get that they want to convey this sense that, like, California is not a small state by any means, and also its highway system is a goddamn nightmare. But there are a lot of chunks that are just like living in a car in these characters' heads, and it's a structural choice that I am not a fan of.
I mean, when we get to the end and there's sort of a parallel set up between him and Renfield, and I'm like, okay, but we didn't, I think, spend enough time with Michael. We didn't spend enough time with either, but Renfield, we have that power of cultural osmosis. We have that picture of him as a poor wretch who deserved better than to be black.
I think it's the dichotomy of Renfield mentions that, like, you cannot trust me, Miss Lucy, because Renfield is ultimately loyal to Dracula. I think Michael is supposed to be the dichotomy of, like, Lucy created him as a thrall accidentally, and she uses him when it is convenient to her, but she is always aware that she cannot use this thrall to her full potential, because that would be becoming like him. And I think he's supposed to be that idea of, like, trying to break the cycle. Like, I have this power. I accidentally thrall people. Like, and that's another thing. Accidental thralls are usually not a thing in other vampire media. You have to be intentional with thralls. I don't know what they're doing there.
Editor Jasmine here, allow me to share an epiphany regarding that. The way I see it, it's to show how even abuse victims can become like their abusers accidentally. When you are in any kind of traumatic situation, you end up picking up bad habits a lot of the time. And this, I feel like, adds to the metaphor there.
I feel like you could have taken the majority of what Michael does and just put it into Daisy, and that would have...
But it also cuts down the other vampire fact of inherent romanticism of blood-sucking.
Does it, though? This is already a queer book. We can pull the trigger on that.
Yeah, but like I get what they're trying to do, I guess, but it doesn't fully work. The thing I was talking about with my friend the other night is there's a lot of great concepts in this book, and there's a lot of like overarching like great idea kernels that I'm like, cool, we can run with that. Let's fucking go. The execution is like on a sliding scale of like 50% great to 70% okay, and there is a distinction, and I think that's my ultimate problem with this book, is that there are a lot of concepts where I'm like, hell yeah, let's fucking go, but the execution of them is like, that is only 50% fantastic, exactly how I want it to go. Like the thing with the sunlight, that only comes up a handful of times, or like how the other rules have affected her. And I don't think we get an example of how holy symbols affect Lucy, but I get that that's not the book that it's trying to tell. Or to like 70% just okay, you know, with the things with, you know, encountering Dracula and encountering the afterlife and dealing with Rochester and what have you. And I think the writing style is engaging. Like I said, I plowed through it in a single sitting. That has to count for something. But the actual execution is just kind of leaving me going, where's the other third of this book?
Circling back to Michael, there is one aspect of which I 100% agree with you that there is some wasted potential here, and that is Michael's status as a veteran. Because he's fully aware of what is happening here.
Oh yeah, he fully has a death wish. That boy is just PTSD part 3 and 4.
Yes, and he that too. He's fully okay with it because PTSD, but also he's just like, do we ever have a choice? And for one thing, in terms of who you end up being drawn to, that is definitely true. And in terms of the fact that he was absolutely drafted and dragged into this fucking game of chess by much more powerful men who were too cowardly to fight their own battles, that was very interesting to me. And if they had added those extra 100 pages, that could have definitely been explored more.
Great concept, middling execution.
Yeah. On the other hand, I'm not really here for Michael, so it doesn't bother me as much. Because you're right. Either you could have taken him out, or you could have expanded upon him. There are just certain stories with certain concepts where it's like, okay, you either have to take this out or you need to expand upon this more.
It kind of feels like they didn't take enough advantage of the 60s setting. Because we do have the hippies, and we have the veterans, and we have the drive-ins as a relic, but because Bea and Lucy are so isolated and disconnected, it doesn't feel like there is enough atmosphere of the 60s. Like, we're living in this age that is
the great
make
era
love,
change.
not war, hippie, flower power, peace, but we're also in full Cold War at this point. And we're only like 20 years out from the use of an atomic bomb, and this fatalism, again, we're missing a third of a story, it feels.
My thing with the 60s and Michael and everything is, again, in my script doctor brain, Michael is their connection back to humanity. At the end, I think at the end of the day, I think that Bea and Lucy's ultimate goal by the end of the book is, yes, supporting the survivors of Rochester and Dracula's abuse and helping them figure out what that survival means. But I think the other thing that Lucy and Bea needed to start doing, and I think that's another thing that folds into my how have you all not coped with your situation, is they are so big in survival mode that they've never figured out how to live.
Yeah.
And I wanted, to some extent, for Michael and Daisy to be their window back into living again, and not just trying to survive for the sake of it. And I think they sort of get that in the whole Lucy's end speech of like, this is my final life, I'm aging in real time sort of thing. But I don't trust them to continue living. I don't trust them to not fall back on their bad coping mechanisms, because they have too many of them, and it's been 70 fucking years, and they have never trained themselves out of their coping mechanisms. They have physically defeated, for now, even like Dracula and Lucy admit that Dracula's only dead for now. Opening the window for a sequel, baby. I joke, don't write a sequel. This book is perfect as a standalone. Well, it's not perfect as a standalone, but it's pretty okay as a standalone. We don't need a sequel. But like, that's the sort of feeling that Dracula, you know, I'm gonna come back, baby. But like, and I get that's the sensation that they want us to have. But having spent 340x pages in Lucy's head, I do not trust her to not fall back on bad coping mechanisms. I don't trust her not to to isolate. And I get that, like, another thing that Lucy offhandedly mentions in that weird final epilogue chapter is that they've started actually talking about what the fuck happened to them, and there are, quote-unquote, no more secrets. But, like, healing isn't linear, and I don't trust them to support each other when said healing is not linear. I want to. God's above, I want to. But evidence has proven to the contrary, and I feel like that's unfair, but I'm also kind of like, I don't know what other answer to give. This book really should have been a split dual POV. God's above.
B needed more screen time.
Especially since, again, she disappears in the entirety of the second act. I cannot stress to you how much B vanishes in the second act.
More time with B might have added more depth to the reveal that B and Jane were in love.
Oh, yeah, no, quite literally, my remark on that is like, okay, so we're queering this bitch, proceed? It's not a full exclamation point proceed, it's a question mark proceed. Like, I guess? Sure, why not?
Especially when it's revealed that, you know, Jane is reporting back to Rochester, that throws some of it into question. Like, does Jane actually love B, or are they, like, trauma bonded? Is this some kind of creepy sister wife thing Rochester has going with them, even though,
I mean, I wouldn't put it past him that that's just a kink of his.
He has this line of bigamy is an ugly word, and yet I meant to be a bigamist, and I'm sitting over here like, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. Ethical non-monogamy is an option.
Absolutely.
But
all in all, 90% of fictional love triangles could have been solved if everyone just agreed to be a polycule.
Right, but we don't necessarily need to see Jane's development, but she has that heel face turn off screen. It's like, no, I'm on your side now. I'm like, yeah, but we've already done this with you and we can't trust you. So what I want to do is I want to be in B's head, and I want to understand how B is working through this question of whether or not I trust you, because Lucy has not trusted Jane for good reason, and Lucy has no reason to trust Jane, but Jane and Lucy aren't emotionally invested. B is emotionally invested.
B also admits it. B, like, spends the last third of this book being incredibly cold to Jane because she doesn't trust the heel face turn.
Right. But I wanted to see that internal monologue.
Yeah, so did I. The notes I took while reading it, and then also my Storygraph review after the fact, which, Jazz, I'm sure you saw, it's just a rambly nightmare. It's one elaborate metaphor about surviving abuse and how it never really leaves you until you face it again, and you can't run from it forever, and how sometimes the best you can do is attempt to break the cycle, and how abusers 9 times out of 10 are the charming ones. I don't know if it works, but I think that's what the book is going for.
Oh, yeah.
I buy Rochester as a villain. He's a sort of uber control freak that I know in real life. Pairing him with Drac doesn't make any sense other than we need to keep Lucy and B together.
Editor Jasmine here, wanting to note that after this recording, I realized that Dorian Gray would have fit in with this a lot better. And how this book portrays Rochester seems a lot closer to that than to Rochester, to be honest. And as Sam pointed out when I pointed this out in the chat, I think the only reason that wasn't the route they went is because Sybil Vane is just not as well known or as talked about in literary circles, which is ridiculous when you think about it, because very similar, screwed over by the narrative female character in this kind of story. I'm gonna fucking do something about that at some point.
And as, I guess, as a bid for power, sure. But, like, man, I don't think that Rochester could cope with being a vampire. Unless, of course, you want to go the route that Rochester has bought into all of the silver screen tales of the romantic, handsome vampire.
Oh, I'm positive he has.
He probably thinks he can be not like the other vampires. I'm an actual sexy vampire. And I'm going to live in Hollywood forever, and I'm going to inspire a lot of bullshit vampire movies.
He doesn't even live in Hollywood. It was in San Francisco.
He probably doesn't know that.
And, you know, that actually makes a whole lot of sense, especially considering the fact cinematic portrayals of these characters ends up being a major aspect of the climax.
Oh my fucking god, I just remembered there's a book called Jane Slayer. S-L-A-Y-R-E.
Yes.
It's on my to-read list. I haven't gotten to it, but now I feel like I have to get to it. God damn it.
Incredible. I don't know, man. I wanted to like this book. I wanted to give you an easy episode in which I want to sing something's praises all the way through, because I feel like I keep coming in on the complicated episodes. Or at least, like, when it's me and Sam. We always come in on the complicated episodes. We don't get to do the fun, easy, like, yeah, we all loved this, right? But, like, God, I don't know what to do, my man. It didn't hit you. Again, like I said, this book is safe with my indifference. To borrow a quote from campaign 1 of Critical Role, this book is safe with my indifference because I would have never read it had not for this podcast, and I thank you for that. But also, I wouldn't go running out to reread it.
That's fair. Like, I do agree that B absolutely deserved more of a spotlight, but if I may, once again, go into the defense of this book, and it's a lot less lukewarm than last time. But yeah, I guess just for me, obviously this isn't the first time I've seen somebody try to tackle the character of Lucy in a different way. It is not as common in Dracula adaptations as I think it should be, because way too often they are trying to romanticize Dracula, and therefore you can't really make Lucy a likable character when you do that, because we like her too much. We're going to be mad at Dracula, because inevitably he's gotta fuck her up, pretty much. And I guess for me, it was just nice to see a story acknowledge, no, this guy is not your sexy vampire boyfriend. He's actually the worst. And I just found it really fascinating, just all the layers of ways that abusers, particularly abusers who are charming white men who with power, just all the layers of how they creep into things. And also just the fact that I actually really enjoyed the purgatory parts, because
the purgatory parts were probably my favorite part. That was such a good manifestation of trauma.
Absolutely. Like, just the fact that we know they're all of their victims, but we hardly see them. We just see kind of their hands just reaching out, trying to reach for some kind of closure.
Mina does say that they're not all Rochester and Dracula's victims.
That is true.
There are also victims of other sort of men about.
I wonder if Justine is in there. The maid
so.
who worked for the Frankenstein family, who Victor threw under the bus.
Yep. You know what? It would make me so fucking happy if it turned out.
This book has kernels of, like, do not do a cinematic universe, but I can hear it.
If Justine is there, I'm so happy.
I
and
enjoy
Elizabeth.
the concept of a shared literary universe much more than I do cinematic universes.
I say cinematic universe, I mean literary. That's a whole fucking thing.
No, I understand, but I'm saying that I like the idea of a shared literary canon more than a shared film canon.
And I loved that Lucy and Mina kept on reuniting there, because I think their friendship is my favorite part of the original story. And Shami and I have talked about this in a previous episode. We really wish more adaptations would have them reunite after Lucy's a vampire, because at the end of the day, just because she's a vampire doesn't mean she has to not be Lucy anymore. You can still love her.
Yeah, but also she ate kids.
Yeah, and yeah, they kind of hand-waved that in this story, I know, but
I don't like it when I don't fully appreciate it when writers are like, actually, everything you know about classic story is wrong. Here's what really happened. I like it when writers are more like, classic story is mostly true, but here's an added perspective to give more context, which is why I like Wide Sargasso Sea so much.
Mm-hmm. Basically, you wish she had grappled with that in a way that would still allow us to
I kind of wish maybe Michael could have also served more as like a proxy, like if she saw flashes of Arthur and Jack and Quincy in him, and it's like, it's just another form of a man trying to, yes, he's my thrall, but also it's just another form of a man trying to possess me and control me and dictate what I should be. And then she comes to this conclusion like, no, they did love me. And there are times when being abused turns you into a terrible person because you're trying to conform yourself to. So I kind of would have liked it if Lucy had acknowledged that her victimhood also led to her having victims of her own, and her more to the extent than she did, because she did acknowledge that, she's eaten people and she is a monster simply by virtue of being a vampire, but she still kind of kept herself at a distance from it in a way that I think missed out on some juicy character moments.
That is actually a really interesting point. Like, I feel like Kiste just felt like she couldn't write her as the actual Blue Fur Lady without making her completely unsympathetic, but the way you pointed that out, if she had just kind of grappled with it, if anything, it would make the fact that she is so terrified of being a monster all the more poignant. But on the other hand, would that have been kind of a point of no return? Like, would she have kind of felt like that's it, I fucking ate kids, like there's no going back from that? Like, I don't know.
Are we, to some extent, I know that we, the three of us, because I know who the three of us are as people, do we think that that is an avoidance because it's Lucy and not someone else? The fact that it's her specific, and that's why the writer was afraid to go down that route. Because again, I reblogged something this morning that was quite literally like, free my girl, she did the same thing as the celebrated male protagonist, but the fandom have labeled her as irredeemable. And
yeah, I mean, that would have been interesting to watch her engage with that.
Yeah.
Then you could come to the answer that, no, that doesn't mean I'm irredeemable. Dracula's irredeemable because he likes doing this. He keeps choosing to do this shitty stuff. He relishes it. I feel bad about it, and I don't want to do it anymore, and that's what makes me good. There are so many stories where redemption arcs are just like...
redemption equals death.
Redemption equals death, or it's just, well, yeah, I'm a monster, I'm a vampire, I kill people, but I feel bad about it. So that makes me redeemable. And I'm like, but you're still killing people.
You can't feel that bad about it. You just feel bad that people don't like you for
hang
it.
on. I've got a fucking bone to pick. The vampire cannot ethically exist under the bullshit morality that we've gotten.
No. I'm specifically talking about the vampires who are like, I feel bad about killing people, but I have to do it anyway, and I haven't. If you have a vampire who exists, and said vampire has to drain the victim in order for them to live, that is a different thing than vampire has no self-control just because it's self-flagellation. Like, the literary Anne Rice canon, she canonically has the little drink, which takes a lot of restraint to do, and then the full drink, the death drinking. And so...
which has been co-opted, and it is more often, like, the example that most people lean on, because, again, we want our sympathetic motherfucking vampires, because there are too many of us that have looked at this creature
and what
of the
I'm
night
not
and stuck
here
out
for
our
is
hand.
what I'm not here for is the vampire who's, like, who has the option of the little drink, but chooses not to, but still does the, oh no, I'm a monster thing.
Yeah.
That pops up
because they always
often than
act
I
like
think
they
you
don't
think.
have a choice, and then you see canonical examples within the same story where, yes, there is a choice, you're just an asshole, and yet we're supposed to be treating this like a redemption arc.
Yeah, and again, I am not immune to charming propaganda, I guess.
Nope.
But also I think I'm desensitized to charming vampires, because I'm like, that's the last thing on my list I'm gonna pick a bone about. Of course it's gonna fucking kill me. It's Mormon, but it's got bigger problems. It could be Mormon. Grow up.
It could be attracted to khaki skirts. God. Oh my god, the Twilight month is gonna be fun. But anyway, final thoughts. I'll grant you that pretty much every single one of your criticisms or script doctoring I do think would have made for a better story. But I guess for me, it didn't stop it from resonating with me. Like,
it didn't stop me in the moment to moment. Again, I plowed through this book, but it's in the, when you've closed the book and you're like, okay, coherent thoughts, what are they? And then finally,
it has
like,
resonant nuggets.
Yeah, and then laying everything out where I was like, because like I said, I was trying to talk to a friend about it, and I was like 144 pages in, and I was like, I am struggling with this book, and I can't tell if it's because I'm only 144 pages in, or if this is just like something that is going to fundamentally be a problem with me in this book. And it turned out that I was just going to be a fundamental problem with me in this book. And that's sometimes how book reading goes, I guess.
like, I guess, Sam, you saying that this is more of a feelings book was absolutely accurate, because most of what you said was more about the plot and like the rules of things, and I guess for me that wasn't what I was here for, so it didn't bother me. I agree with you.
I never doubted the feelings. Did I think that they could have been handled differently?
Yes.
Yes. But also I acknowledge that that's not what this book was trying to do.
Exactly. I guess that's really it. Like, this book was not really here for...
It's not to my taste.
Yeah, exactly. It's not here for, like, really complex world building. It's not really here for being married to the source material. Obviously not. It's here for using these characters as, again, a metaphor for dealing with abuse. And unfortunately, I've never dealt with that in my life, really. But I guess because I know so many people who have, And I guess for me, it's just like, sometimes I do just want the heroines of stories that I do love but wish had gotten a better deal in their story just get to kick these fuckers' asses and get to come out better people for it. And I know for you, River, you didn't quite believe they wouldn't slip into it. I guess I just wanted to believe that, because at the end of the day, you kind of have to suspend your disbelief to believe in a happy ending in these stories, because there's really no such thing.
So why do we keep telling them?
Yeah, why do we keep on telling Dracula and Jane Eyre again?
Well, first of all, vampire's hot.
Yes. Correct.
Second of all, Jane Eyre, to the point that several people have pointed out, is just fancy German word for coming of age story, but told for a woman. And so that's just a structure that can be easily aped for literally anything.
It does technically fall under the I can fix him story.
Oh, it absolutely is.
Rochester is by technicality a Byronic hero. Put it in air quotes. Your mileage may vary on how you feel about said Byronic hero tendencies, but Lord Byron does come for us all.
Hey,
The one good thing that motherfucker did was father Ada Lovelace.
Correct.
He's also a very good...
I mean, I guess we can also say he also pissed off Mary Shelley enough that she created a whole ass genre.
I mean, if you have the stomach for it, I highly recommend the comic New Romantics, which essentially has a modern-day computer programmer accidentally put the conscience of Lord Byron into a millennial body, and part of the plot is contacting a ghost of Ada Lovelace to try and take her father out of said body. It's a very funny book. I don't think I understand it, but it's a deeply funny book. And Byron is as much of a pompous dickhead as a millennial Byron you can imagine. But check it out, it's a fun time. But I think, I think Dracula also kind of gets the Byronic hero treatment. And I think
and there are people I would like to blame for that, but I can't blame them for that on this podcast because it struck work.
You are not immune to loving fictional men that are not entirely feminist. And you are not immune to compelling characters. And again, it's like you said, if I'm being honest, it is a lot more fun to take apart and reimagine something that is inherently a little flawed than try and work with something that is perceived as good and perfect. Like, there is a reason that, structural changes aside, you cannot do a straight retelling of Dracula, because Dracula's been defanged, he's been declawed. He is no longer this beast of the night, because he was never a beast of the night, not in the original book. He's not particularly scary. What he is kind of a charming abuser.
Yeah.
And there's too much potential in playing around the horrific monster space, and I will continue to be a monster fucker at any given opportunity. Vampire's hot, motherfucker. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Even if part of why I enjoyed it is the fact they kind of brought Dracula back to his roots.
And, with Jane Eyre, it's a case of, Rochester is such an easy target because he's just a white guy. He's just an abusive white guy. There are thousands of those, but you can put a bullet in his head.
Well, the funny thing is that they absolutely still do retellings of Jane Eyre as straight romances. I know at least 3 of them that have come out just this year.
And you can go that route, sure, fine and dandy. There are plenty of angles where you could play that even semi-straight. But to quote the great John Green's Crash Course, but there is a telling factor that Jane does not come back to marry Rochester until she's on her own footing. That is an interpretation that you can run with. And I think to some extent, if you give Jane a modern level of emotional intelligence and you take away some of her inherent I can fix him energy and instead have her whack him upside the head and being like, stop being an emotionally constipated dickhead, fucking send Rochester to therapy, and there is an angle where you can play it as a straight romance. And again, it's
I'll send you the link to that modern AU.
And again, it's the whole angle of playing with something flawed and getting a better product out of it.
I mean, a part of me also thinks we keep coming back to Jane Eyre now because we're trying to reclaim Antoinetta.
We've been trying to reclaim her since the book you mentioned.
Wide Sargasso Sea.
Yeah, again, which is looking back on one of my first interactions with Jane Eyre. Most modern people are like, hey, it's actually not okay to lock someone up in the attic for just quote-unquote being crazy, especially considering the fact how easily women achieved that label back in the day.
Yeah.
It's like, maybe we should talk about this as a society. Final thoughts?
Glad I read it, wouldn't do it again.
Please also read Wide Sargasso Sea.
I promise I will.
More polyamory and everything.
Correct. Yes. No. Let's have a modern Dracula adaptation where Lucy was just going to be in the polycule. I'd rock with that.
Pen and then plugs, or plugs and then pens?
I think we usually do pens first, but yeah,
Alright.
before we do, it's like, yeah, like again, I hear all of your criticisms, but for me, this made for a really great mood piece that just kind of tackles all the ways in which privileged, charming men ruin everything, but we don't have to let them. We don't have to keep letting them. And that is my final piece. I love this book.
Alright. We have this many pens.
Okay.
3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
You know what? Still better than the Carmilla episode. I got up to like 25, guys.
Oh my
Jesus
god.
Christ.
I mean, part of the problem is that Carmilla is such a pop culture reference heavy work, but also Ellie kept referencing things, and I'm just like, Ellie, just because it's foreign doesn't mean we're in the clear. But anyway, yes, let's go ahead. Who's got stuff to plug?
Please keep supporting the Entertainment Community Fund. They haven't been getting paid for months now. A lot of
They
them
need
don't
help.
have health insurance because of what happened. And also Gavin Newsom decided not to do unemployment for striking. Fuck you, Gavin. You have completely botched any chance you have of ever being president now.
Or re-election.
Be president. No.
Oh, he can't be reelected anyway. He's on his second term as California governor.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. Well, yeah, never gonna be president. And like keep
Never gonna be president now.
And how dare you ruin what little goodwill you had from the height of COVID, sir?
Politicians ain't shit.
And also, I am bouncing around the internet under various iterations of femfictional. You can find me probably very easily. I live in Jasmine's walls.
Yes.
As the other resident wall dweller, you can find me on Twitter at Dreams Rebel. We are in single digits drops from hockey season, baby, and I'm about to become insufferable.
Oh.
You can also, hopefully, by the time this episode goes up, find me on WordPress at filmlion, no hyphens, no space, .wordpress.com, where you can read all of my bullshit thoughts about television, because I've decided that I might as well take my professional opinion haver moniker seriously.
Yay! And as always, you can find me on Twitter, Tumblr, and TikTok under Faye Riviera, and this podcast at IER Podcasts on Twitter. Coming up next, we will actually be discussing something a little different. In honor of an event at my local library, we are actually going to be discussing our own local urban legends. Ooh! Hope to see you there, and remember, stories gain power in each retelling.
St. John is unmarried. He will never marry now. Himself has hitherto sufficed to the toil, and the toil draws near its close. His glorious sun hastens to its setting. The last letter I received from him drew from my eyes human tears, and yet filled my heart with divine joy. He anticipated his sure reward, his incorruptible crown. I know that a stranger's hand will write to me next, to say that the good and faithful servant has been called at length into the joy of his Lord. And why weep for this? No fear of death will darken St. John's last hour. His mind will be unclouded, his heart will be undaunted, his hope will be sure, and his faith steadfast. His own words are a pledge of this. My master, he says, has forewarned me. Daily he announces more distinctly, surely I come quickly. And hourly I more eagerly respond, Amen, even so, come, Lord Jesus.
7 years ago, we all went through the flames. And the happiness of some of us since then is, we think, well worth the pain we endured. It is an added joy to Mina and to me that our boy's birthday is the same as that on which Quincy Morris died. His mother holds, I know, the secret belief that some of our brave friend's spirit has passed into him. His bundle of names links all of our little band of men together, but we call him Quincy. In the summer of this year, we made a journey to Transylvania and went over the old ground which was and is to us so full of vivid and terrible memories. It was almost impossible to believe the things we have seen with our own eyes and heard with our own ears were living truths. Every trace of all that had been was blotted out. The castle stood as before, reared high above the wastes of desolation.